Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to week 3 of the COVID-19 My Business, What Do I Need to Do Now? Funded by the Humber Growth Hub as part of the Grow My SME program. Welcome back to those that are joining us for our third time, and welcome to those that are joining us for the first time this week. This session has been designed as a one-stop shop, as a meeting place for local businesses across the Humber region to help them navigate the support landscape, for you to understand what support's available both nationally and locally, as well as getting some up-to-date, relevant and appropriate business advice on how to keep your business going, survive this current crisis, but most importantly, how to rebuild once this crisis is over. Today I'm joined by a revised panel of specialist advisors and consultants. For those that have been with us the last couple of weeks, we've had a very similar agenda today. We are mixing things up a little bit. Starting us off today will be Peter Daniel, Area Manager and Blue Orchid Senior Business Advisor, who's going to go through some of the national programmes and updates in terms of what support's available for businesses and for the self-employed. For those that have you'll recognise Mike Byrne, Blue Orchid Business Advisor and a qualified accountant, who's going to talk about legal issues and some financial issues that you should be aware of, both during this period of time of the COVID-19 crisis, as well as support that might be available moving forward. And we will try and touch where we can upon universal credit support for those that are currently self-employed. We will then move on to our next guest speaker, Steve Page, who's the Director of Page Consulting. Steve is a business owner, growth coach, general business enthusiast, and for the purposes of today, will be our business continuity specialist, and will speak to us about how we can make sure we are covered in terms of contingency plans and continuity plans moving forward to help our businesses come out of this situation that we find ourselves in. Following Steve's presentation, I'm very pleased to introduce Stella Jacobs, Director of Infolaw, who will be talking to us about GDPR policies today and the importance of understanding and revising and evaluating your GDPR policies when you're home-based working. So I'm pretty sure a lot of businesses have already thought about GDPR from last year and have got processes in place to cover themselves as a business and individually when working normally for their company, but have things changed now that you're based from home. So Stella's going to point out some of the key things that we need to be understanding and aware of when working from home from a GDPR perspective. Following on from Stella's presentation, we're going to go back to our usual specialist provider, Kelly Calvert, Director of Humber HR People, who will be talking to us again about HR, the furlough scheme, any updates that we've had since last week's presentation, and any other relevant up-to-date data that she can provide us with. And then following Kelly, another new presenter for us today, we have Rachel Alexander, who is the Director of I Can Handle It, a training company which educates on how to improve the mental well-being of employees. She helps businesses and their employees to understand and manage their own mental health and teach leaders on how to manage mental health in others. So very important subject, really, one that we're very happy to put onto the agenda for today to make sure we're all in the right mental frame of mind working from home. I know as a business owner that it's very hard to try and keep lethargy at the door to make sure you can keep working on your business and survive in this situation we're in. And today, hopefully, we'll get some top tips from Rachel on how we can do that as business owners and for our employees. Following our usual presentations, we will go to our question and answer panel. And as normal, we would encourage everybody today to ask questions throughout the presentation. Please don't wait until the end. If you hear a presentation and you've got a pertinent question, something that might be bespoke to you or to your business, please use the question function, not the chat function, the question function on your dashboard. Log all your questions and we'll make sure we will endeavour to get all your questions answered before the end of today's session. At the end of the session today, I'll also explain to you about what other supports available from the Growth Hub and the details of upcoming workshops that we'll be providing. So that's it for me in terms of introduction. Please don't forget to use your question function to ask your questions along the way. But for now, I'd like to hand you over to Peter Daniel. Thank you, Peter.
Hi, thank you very much, Paul. So I'm just going to run through very quickly about what support is available in general from the government for people affected by the current COVID-19 situation. The very first I'm going to go through is the main self-employed support scheme. So this business is on par with furloughed employees, where all self-employed people will receive 80% of profits for 3 months as a taxable grant. Now, just going to run through a little bit of eligibility for this. The very first bit of eligibility is this is for people who are self-employed with profits of less than 50,000. So if you're over that, unfortunately, you don't qualify for this. The other thing here is it's for people who have filed their 2019 tax returns. This is the tax return that you should have filed in January this year. So as long as you filed that and you're under that 50,000 in terms of the profits, then you are okay and you should be eligible for this. Now, one of the questions I get asked all the time is, I work employed and I'm self-employed at the same time. Am I eligible for this? Well, yes, you are, providing that self-employment is the main source of your income. So it needs to be over 50% of your income, as per your tax return would show. You would be eligible for this. Now, how do I apply for this? Well, you don't need to. HMRC have all this information. You've submitted your 2019 tax return January or before, so therefore they will have this information. So you don't need to do anything to apply for this. You will get a letter from HMRC, which they hope to be sometime mid-May, and then payments will be in June. Unfortunately, you've got to wait until June for the payments, and it will be in the form of a taxable grant. So what's a grant? We don't have to pay it back. That's the key point here. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the job retention scheme. So this is for furloughed employees. So it's supporting businesses who have no work for their employees. This one is where businesses can claim 80% of the salary, up to 2,500 plus the national insurance and pension contributions for employees who are unable to work. They're unable to work. Therefore, there's no work for them, say the shop's closed or something along those lines, and it's so they can keep on the payroll. There's a couple of changes with this one fairly recently. The dates have changed from the 28th of February to the 19th of March, so that's included a lot more people, but I'm sure we'll go through that a bit later on. Now, with a lot of these funds, both the job retention scheme, which although has come, the portal's come live this week, and the self-employed one, there is a delay for the payments for this, and you've got to think about your cash flow. So I'm going to talk now about the tax and VAT deferment. The tax is the main one here. So for most people, you pay your tax in two sums, one in January, one in July. What the government have said here is the July payment for your tax you can defer until January next year. So this doesn't mean you don't have to pay it. You still have to pay it, but it means you don't have to pay it until January next year. Again, this is automatic. This is automatic. This allows you to use some of this as cash flow until your payments for things like the self-employed scheme will come into effect. Normally, I wouldn't ever suggest moving in or using any of your money you've put aside for tax for cash flow, because at the end of the day, you've still got to pay it. It's not really your money, but in this sort of situation, I would say it is something where you could use. You just have to remember when the money comes in from things like your self-employed, or the job retention scheme, which you've used this for, you need to replenish it, because you still are going to have to pay this tax bill. The tax bill is still due. It's just due in January next year instead of July this year. So it's giving you a little bit more freedom with money. A couple of other things to talk about is business rates relief. So I'm going to say most businesses now are eligible for rates relief because it does include retail, it includes leisure, it includes hospitality, it includes children's nurseries. So if you fall into any of those sectors, you are eligible for business rates relief. Now that's for the 2020-2021 period, and therefore that's there also to give you some some breathing space in terms of cash flow. Other things to talk about is the business interruption loan schemes. This is one of the very first things the government introduced, and it's open to all small to medium enterprises. It's there to help businesses, again, with cash flow, so that if you're a viable business, you can gain the funding to see you through this period. It's a government-backed loan, but it is still a loan. You still have to repay it back, and it operates in the same way of any other loan. Applications work in the same way as any other loan. There are over 40 providers of it, and the main ones I would say to speak to are your banks. But there are second-tier lenders, there are some of the investment funds who are operating on this. So it is a case of shop around. It is a case of see what's available and see which one suits you. But always with any loans, first port of call is always your main high street bank. As I say, it is government backed. So what it's there to do, it's there to help you gain that funding, there to mean that you don't have to put down the personal guarantees that you may well have done in normal situations. But remember, still a loan, still got to be paid back and still applied for in the same manner. Now, a new kid on the block here, announced on the 20th of April, so only the last couple of days, is the new Future Fund. So what is the new Future Fund? Well, things are fairly sketchy in terms of what that actually covers, but it's there to help support businesses who aren't covered by any of the other loan funds. We're looking mainly, I think, at tech companies, new starts, those sort of businesses where they haven't really got the history, they haven't got the equity, they're more, it was described very well earlier as speculative at the moment. So as I say, information on this one is fairly low at the moment, but it's there as a bit more of to catch a few of the other businesses who haven't been eligible for things like the self-employed, the job retention scheme, or aren't able to access the business loan interruption scheme. Applications for that is going to open mid-May and will run to September. As I say, more information for that as it comes out. So just a few things here, just a few highlights which I want to make sure are covered. First one here, the self-employed scheme. You can still work. Unlike furloughed, if you're furloughed, you can't work. Self-employed, you are still able to work. So it is a case of go out, still earn the money, still progress the business. And in actual fact, it says you must be trading next year in the 2021 period. So you need to keep going with the business. So look at how you can change it. Review the business, keep promoting it, get ready for that next bit. If you haven't submitted your 2019 tax return, you do have a little bit of time. They're giving you a little bit extra time to do that, but you only have until the 23rd of April to do that. So you need to really get that done today to be eligible for the self-employed scheme. So if you've submitted your tax return, last year's tax return we're talking about here, not the one which is finished on the 5th of April this year, the one that finished on the 5th of April 2019, you do have to get that in. Get it in as soon as you possibly can. You need to have it in by tomorrow to be eligible for this. They're going to look at the last 3 years tax returns, but if you've only got one, only got two, that's what they'll review. That's what they'll review. Now, one of the other things here is if you're a limited company, you're not self-employed. So we would be having to look at the other schemes. And one of the ones to look at is the job retention scheme. If you're a director of a limited company, often you are employed by that company. Now, not all the time, but often you are. And you'll take a mixture of dividends and a mixture of PAYE. The PAYE part of it, you can claim under the furlough scheme as a director. The only thing is here, you must remember you are not working in the business. You're furloughed, you can't work in the business, and you can only gain 80% of that money in. So if you're paying yourself a mixture of PAYE and dividends, unfortunately those dividends don't get covered. It is just the PAYE aspect of it, but it is something, it is part of the lifeline there. Now, if you are also looking at other ways to manage that sort of cash flow as a self-employed person or as an employed person, universal credit is the other means. Now, this has been about for a couple of years now, so it's nothing new. So a few things I want to go through in terms of universal credit. So if you are applying for universal credit, you can do this online. So the application process is to be done online. Now they're having a lot of applications for this. I've been told about 1.4 million new applications recently for this. So it is taking a bit of time, and the system is creaking a little bit under the weight of this. But they're redeploying people from other aspects of the job centre. They're working long hours, weekends to try and get this through as quick as possible, because they realise that for some people this is a lifeline that's needed. A lot of people will discount this because of their self-employed income, but they have changed a few things again to make things a little bit easier and to help people out. So there are enhanced amounts, mainly with things like the housing caps and things like that have been relaxed. They have also relaxed the minimum income floor. So the minimum income floor was the amount that they assumed you earned as a self-employed person. Well, they've got rid of that for the moment. At the moment, that doesn't apply, so they'll be taking into account any earnings coming in. There are also other benefits that you might want to consider. And I suggest everybody has a look on the .gov.uk website, where there's a great benefits calculator, and you can type in exactly where you are and it will tell you what you're eligible for. A few points here. If you are self-employed and you're applying for universal credit, do not say that the business has stopped. If you say the business has stopped, that may well delay the claim, because they want to see proof that it's stopped. But you can work as a self-employed person and claim universal credit. So at this point, you are looking at restarting the business. So therefore, just say that the business is continuing, but the income has fallen. That is the way to progress that, so you don't have those delays. It is based upon what income comes in, so you can still operate the business, you can still get the income in from the business, and the universal credit will flex with that income. So the more you earn from the business, the less universal credit, the less from the business, the more universal credit. Point to note here is if you're self-employed and gaining the payment in June from the self-employed support scheme, that may well wipe out any universal credit you get that month, because obviously you'll have a large income that month, and that's where the taxable part of it comes in. It is just an income. It's like you doing a job as a part of your self-employed and you getting that money in. So it is just a bonus month, I'm going to say, from the self-employed part, which will reduce your universal credit down. So it will give you a nil claim that month. Key thing here, I think, for any of these schemes is have a look at them, see what you're eligible for. Most of them are a case of there's not much for you to do at the moment. Self-employed one, it's sit and wait. The furloughed one, well, that one is open at the moment if you're just the support scheme, so there is things to do there. Universal credit, check you're eligible for that. And if you're looking at the loans one, well, that is still the same process, same sort of loan scheme, same way going forward. Key thing, as I say, keep working, keep the businesses going, and it's see you on the other side. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Now I'm going to move on to Mike Byrne, who's going to talk to us now about finance and legal situations regarding your business and any updates that he's gauged from the government over the last week. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks very much, Paul. As ever, dealing with a financial crisis requires you to think clearly about managing your money. And I think if you go to the next slide, Paul, you'll see that I've listed, I think, some of the statistics that are available. There's always a lag when you see statistics about the economic impact, and this is the 5th of April, so it's not in statistical terms, it's very, very up to date, but of course things are moving so quickly in this particular situation that some of these figures may have changed in the last 2 or 3 weeks. 40% of businesses have been hit by a fall in income, a fall in sales, but 75% of businesses are still trading. 21% of the workforce are not at work at the moment. There's no work for them. They've been furloughed. 40% of firms have reduced staff numbers, but yet again, 7% have taken people on, and nearly half of businesses have now got employees working remotely. Maybe that's the last thing in the future going forward to think about. The 47% of businesses working remotely indicates maybe changing working patterns, which may affect how you structure your business through and beyond the virus outbreak, the interruption that's taken place. So I may have made the point before about seeing things as immediate action you have to take, and also thinking about further ahead in the longer term situation as far as your business is concerned, and whether you need to maintain your business, change your strategy, think about your marketing strategy, and then follow through with a sensible financial package or approach that's going to get you to achieve your business objectives. So on the next slide, I've listed some of the things that amount to an action plan for the very immediate consequences of losing a lot of your turnover or in some way being impacted by this particular business economic interruption. In terms of planning, you need to manage the fall in your turnover and reduce those expenses that where you can. It may sound like common sense, but it's sometimes in business is seen differently from managing your household. You need to have an idea of what is a priority very clearly in terms of what you spend, what will be a limited amount of money coming into your business, unless you've built up a cash reserve in the past. And as you can imagine, or as you'll have seen, the government's assistance is very much aimed at helping businesses with their immediate cash flow issues, not assuming that businesses had ever expected this kind of shock. And certain businesses, certain categories or sectors have been considered to be more at risk of failure. And that accounts for the fact that retail, hospitality, leisure and nurseries, childcare businesses with premises have been those to be offered the grants that have been mentioned previously for the immediate costs of the premises, which are so serious and so likely to cause a business failure. But in overall terms, for all businesses, there is help available from which is coming through banks and coming through local authorities and the government. So overdraft facilities are sometimes partly part of the package of financial support that businesses have. Most banks are taking action there where they can in good faith to extend those facilities. So it's worth looking at your bank to see if they're offering that kind of thing that can immediately help where you've got bills to pay. Talked about property costs in connection with retailers and other types of businesses with property, but employees, of course, is a big cost, and that is the reason behind the immediate and in fact opening yesterday the opportunity to furlough your staff and therefore keep them on the payroll, keep paying them, but to get 80% of that cost or 80% of their wages funded, so that cost is actually removed from your immediate concerns. So if there's one fundamental message, it is to work to a cash flow forecast, a forecast of income and expenses for the next 3 months. You'll find information about that on the government's business support new business support website, but you'll also get help from that if you get in touch with Blue Orchid and other organizations, maybe through your local growth hub that will be helping you through this period. If I can move to the next slide. I'd like to just say a few more words about some aspects of the job retention scheme. I started to think of it as a wage subsidy. Perhaps that's unfair to describe it like that, but the emphasis or the purpose of that scheme is to allow businesses to maintain their establishment, to keep people on the payroll. It's based on PAYE records. What will happen is an employer is expected to continue to pay staff that can't work, but will recover the money by or through grant aid from government through a process which only began 2 days ago, and as you might have seen on the news, was very busy. The extension of the period to 19th of March does enable more people to be covered by the scheme. And HMRC have ambitiously announced that they will seek to reimburse employers who are entitled to use this or who use the scheme within 6 days. That's very ambitious, and I think that we've got to accept that in good faith. There will be that gap. My colleagues in the accounting profession have reported that the system is easy to use, although it does take a little time. And directors of their own limited companies are included in this process. There is controversy and maybe discussion about some of the detail of that. But there's no doubt that if, as a director of your own limited company, part of your earnings are on the PAYE record, in other words, a small salary or smallish salary in comparison to the rest of your income, that would be the amount that you could be entitled to receive under this scheme. Although many directors of their own limited companies will have to take their own view as to whether it's sensible for them to use the scheme, or it's more sensible for them to plow on with their business and continue to generate income. That's a business decision that they have to make. What do you need, or what does an employer need to access this scheme? They need the reference numbers and of their employees. They need their company registration number and their unique tax reference, normal information that would identify them, and then the names, national insurance numbers, and the amounts that they're claiming on behalf of all the employees that are on their payroll. And this claim must be for, or people who they claim for must be paid for a minimum of 3 weeks. So there's a bit more detail about that. I'm sure we might discuss some issues in questions later. So I think I can move to the next slide. Moving away, I suppose, from the immediate action that you have to take in the longer run. Although the first scheme out of the blocks from as far as the businesses, the government was concerned to help businesses, was an immediate loan scheme. It didn't reach as far as I think they initially hoped. The Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme involves over 40 lenders. That is a range of financial institutions, including banks and community development finance institutions and other lenders, who can be approached directly to access the scheme and lend it to businesses that need to borrow money to tide them over this period of time. But the scheme can involve loans that last over 6 years, or be repaid over 6 years. There's no need to take that long. You can pay back the loan over a period of time that you consider appropriate. But it's an indication that this may deal with the business interruption, but it may also help finance your business beyond that and longer than that. Now, every lender in this scheme will have their own lending criteria, and that means you can shop around amongst those 40 plus lenders. But it also means that many people will apply and be disappointed by some of the lenders in there who maybe set a minimum amount you have to borrow or have other reasons to decline. There may be lenders who take a stronger view about the history of the business, the previous accounting records of the business, or the credit status of the business, or the credit status of the individual borrowing money. So the lender makes the decision. Some things have improved in terms of not needing to have a personal guarantee or a guarantee of the loan or security if you're borrowing less than £250,000, but the lender still makes the decision. And the only advice to be taken there really is to think about why you were turned down. Maybe try another lender that will take a different view. Now, if you're self-employed or you run a company, what you will need is a clear idea of the amount of the loan that you want to borrow, the purpose and the length of time over which you intend to pay it back. You'll need to show that your business is on a sound commercial footing, and that's done by showing your previous management accounts. That does make it more difficult for a startup or very early stage business to get one of these loans, but that's why that's been dealt with to some extent by the introduction of another package of lending, which is called a future fund. But that's still a problem. Management accounts are wanted by a lender where they exist. If your business has been going for 3 or 4 years, they'd like to have a look at how it's done. For the future, you'll need a business plan and a cash flow forecast. You will also have to give more information depending on the amount that is being borrowed. So, and the official tax return maybe is also something that they'd look at as well. Community development and finance institutions, just mentioned those in past. They are participating in the in what's called the CBILS. They are participating in this scheme, but they're also active in lending. They have been active in lending to people who've been turned down by banks for 20 or 30 years. So they're more experienced in dealing with the smaller business. They're more experienced in dealing with the kind of issues that come up in these kind of circumstances where business viability is questioned and so on. So I'd take a look at those organizations. I think the website for those is responsiblefinance.org.uk, which you can look at the alternatives to the commercial lenders if you so wish. I think there's another slide, Paul, if I can move on from that. In fact, it's the last thing I'm going to talk about, is to try and set this in a legal framework. Peter's already mentioned about the time to pay, where it's actually available. And as far as tax is concerned, HMRC has always had a facility for you to get time to pay should trading income fall after the period of time over which you are subject to pay tax. Tax is always collected after the event. So if later on you're not doing as well as you were when you were subject to an assessment for tax that was much higher, you can always ask HMRC for a reasonable amount of time to pay, so long as you do that before the amount is due. Now, that on top of that, in this circumstance of the COVID-19, the government has introduced even more flexibility on that, and has provided reallocated a large number of staff to that particular issue. Rates holidays, again, is a kind of legal issue to give those businesses that I've mentioned there, retail, hospitality, shops, nurseries, to give them an automatic business rates holiday for 2020-21 is a real help to those businesses in that sector, as is for all businesses the legal framework preventing the landlord taking eviction proceedings in this period of business interruption. Now, whenever you're talking about something which isn't a grant, which is a loan, or which is a forgiveness of an obligation, then it remains something that has to be paid. So if you're able to push back commercial rent into the future, that obligation still remains. And I'd say one thing about cash flow in businesses. If, for example, you offer credit, and let's say it's 60 or 90 days, be very careful to understand that what that happens is your cash flow problem is not right now. Your cash flow problems may be September or October, unless you very carefully provide yourself with the finance to manage those events in the future. So it's very easy to solve a short-term problem 3 months now to create a problem 3 months later, and just make sure that you plan carefully for when those future obligations actually come back into your business. That's connected slightly to the fact that the government has relaxed the approach to insolvency that's adopted in law. Carrying on a business in an insolvent position is viewed as illegal because you're supposed to know whether you're solvent or not. But in a circumstance of uncertainty, you don't know whether your business will get through this, but you continue to trade, and that won't be held against you in any kind of legal proceedings. I'm not sure that's great comfort, but it is at least an example of where the government has intervened in the legal framework that we all operate in. Just finally say, do use, if you have an accountant, do use their services. Again, I know from my colleagues in the profession that they are working long hours and not normally charging for the help that's needed for business. It's in their interests to help you at this time, because you'll become, I'm sure, a loyal customer in the future if you haven't already been. So do use your financial advisor, do seek business advice, seek it from Orchid, look for the detail of the schemes. There are more schemes, I might add, coming out almost every week. Offerings now of financial grants from organizations like Google and Facebook that you wouldn't have imagined. But in this unprecedented circumstance, that kind of help is available. You will find it. You will find information on gov.uk, the government's website. You'll also find a lot of information on the local growth hub, who are always picking up information on these new schemes and new possibilities for financing your business. I hope that's helpful. I'll look forward to questions a little later on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Thank you for that detailed presentation. Before I pass on to our next speaker, just a reminder to everybody who's joining us, please do ask any questions that you might have or you might be considering asking. Please fire them off on the questions section of your dashboard there on the GoToWebinar website. We will collate them and ask them at the end. Without further ado, I'd like to now pass you over to Steve Page, who's going to talk us through business continuity support. Steve.
Hi, thanks, Paul. Hope everybody's keeping safe out there. Good afternoon to you. What I'm going to do is just spend a short bit of time having a little look at business continuity planning and how it might be able to help you in your particular business circumstances, particularly in the context of where we are and potentially what might still be yet to be experienced in the future as the consequential threats of the aftermath of COVID are still to be experienced. So we're going to have a little chat about business continuity planning and how that might help you for the future, touch on some key considerations that you need to be looking at as part of trying to work out what the best route forward for you is going to be, and also to just touch on putting together a simple, fairly straightforward business continuity plan, so that some of the thoughts and ideas that you might be having about the future can be brought together into sort of a single document or spreadsheet that then helps you to develop your strategy moving forward. What I also want to do is just briefly touch on a few of the local or Humber Business Growth Hub initiatives and support schemes. These complement and are added to the national schemes, which Peter and Mike spoke about earlier. So really just to signpost you to that humbergrowthhub.org website, where there's an awful lot of information available to support you. So if we could have the next slide then, Paul, thank you. So business continuity plan. Some of you will have sat through earlier sessions and have already got a little bit of an understanding of this. However, there'll be others that have just joined us for the first time today. So what I'm wanting to try to do is sort of a refresher for those who've already had a previous drop-in, but also sort of set things for those that are experiencing the drop-in for the first time, just to help you to understand what might be a fantastic technique for you to help moving forward. So Business continuity planning then, what is it and why is it so important? Well, fundamentally, it's a methodology that will help you to take a step back from the day-to-day activities of your business and fundamentally have a look at the threats and risks that your business might be exposed to both now and in the future, with the view that you can start to do something about it in good time. So that old adage, to be forewarned is to be forearmed, is absolutely true in this case. And for those of you who've sort of been involved in a crisis in your business before, you'll know that if you get that opportunity to see what might be coming at you before it hits you, it gives you that golden window of opportunity to just put some things in place which might prevent the impact on you altogether, or if not, certainly reduce the impact that it might have so that you can recover from it much more quickly and easily. And business continuity planning is fundamentally a tool to help you to do that. So it's a system for creating plans to help you to prevent, or if you're unable to prevent, to then recover from future risks that may impact on you from time to time. Now, there'll be a range of companies who are sat listening in this afternoon, and you'll all have different levels of business continuity planning experience and knowledge. From those businesses that may be in an industry where business continuity planning is not just a requirement, but is absolutely essential because so many customers are utterly reliant upon those businesses continuing to receive the services that are provided, whether that be electricity or food or whatever. They have got very, very comprehensive business continuity plans in place and will have already taken a whole series of steps and had resources put to one side to deal with them when this outbreak occurred. However, not every business is in that fortunate position, and there'll be some businesses that have done some business continuity planning, may have put some resources to one side, and particularly a cash buffer, because cash provides you with a really great flexible resource to help you to deal with the situation. They rely on that to sort of compensate for the fact that their planning might be sort of okay, but there's still some sort of detail that could have been added to it. And there'll be a group of businesses that have done no business continuity planning at all, some because they don't understand the benefit from it, and others because they've never really come across it before and don't know what's involved. So my chat this afternoon really is looking at those two latter groups, the ones who've got some planning in place, but it maybe hasn't been quite as comprehensive as they would have liked it to have been, and those that haven't really done a great deal at all and would really benefit from putting together a fairly simple plan that just sort of gets them on that path moving forward. When we're talking about business continuity planning, fundamentally we're talking about business resilience. And the sort of definition around resilience is an organization's resistance to failure. So it's resistance to failure, or its resilience is its ability to withstand changes in its environment and still continue to function. Even if it gets knocked out for a couple of days, it's back on its feet and able to function in a relatively short period afterwards. So if we could have the next slide, please, Paul. Thank you. So it was Benjamin Franklin who famously said, by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. And never was a truer word spoken. Now, in the context of COVID-19 and the experiences that we've had, I don't think I'm giving away any secrets when I say that I think the whole world was underprepared for the COVID-19 pandemic. When you sort of look back over the last decade, there have been all sorts of prophecies of doom that have come around associated with global pandemics. There was the SARS, the bird flu outbreak. There's been a number of them, and each one of them has had large death projections, economic collapses. There have been a variety of really major predictions that have come with them. And really, none of that has quite come to fruition, thank goodness. So you can understand there's been some skepticism and some lack of preparation, even though the World Health Organization had identified it as its highest priority in terms of all of the threats that might impact on the world. Many nations have been caught poorly prepared for that. And when they did see it coming, they scrambled around to try to use that golden window of opportunity in order to try to prepare as best they can in the time that they've had available to them, and some better than others. So this is the same sort of situation that we're finding with businesses. You know, even the best prepared have never been quite prepared to meet every aspect associated with the pandemic that we're currently experiencing. So with that in mind, the severity, the complexity, we've never been here quite like this before. There are a whole series of consequential threats that come off the back of it. Not just relaxing the restrictions too quickly and then having a second spike in terms of deaths and a further lockdown and the implications of that on the economy, but also the whole marketplace will be changing significantly as a result of incrementally and cautiously, step by step, reducing the restrictions and lifting some of the opportunities to trade for the future. And that's going to be quite an uncertain time and will bring an awful lot of threat and risk associated with it, partly because of the uncertainty, but partly because it's going to be a rapidly changing, quickly evolving situation, and businesses will need to stay on top of that if they're going to be able to survive and potentially prosper off the back of that situation. So there couldn't be a better time than now to start to think about the future and the sort of steps that you might need to take in order for your business to either continue to survive and trade through this period, or if it isn't trading currently, to find its feet again and be able to continue to trade as those restrictions start to change and get reduced. So I can't implore upon you enough to take that little bit of time out to start to put some business continuity in place, because it should pay dividends to you moving forward. So on next slide, where do we start with all of this? Well, there are some things that need to be sorted out if they haven't already. And I've just put sort of like some common areas, checklists for you in terms of where to start. So fundamentally, looking after your employees. Your workforce is your greatest asset as a business. And therefore, if you're trading at the moment, you will need that workforce. And if you're not, but are seeking to get back on your feet and trade again in the future, you will need people working for you. So it's critically important that we look after the staff that we have. We give them the equipment that they need to be able to work safely at home where we are able to continue to employ them, and that we communicate with them and involve them and engage them in the business activities, not just for their health and well-being, but also to be able to recover the situation quickly and rapidly in the future. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about this because I know Kelly and Rachel will be talking about employment law and mental health and well-being a little bit later on, and they'll pick up a lot of the additional details that will be really useful to you here. So, having got that sort of area properly sorted out and really clear, focusing on your critical processes is another thing. Now, not every part of your business operation is critical to you being able to continue to trade, so it's key that you identify the ones that really are, and you focus your attention on making sure that they are robust or that they can be recovered quickly if they have been held back as a result of the situation that you're in. That's really important. And when I say critical processes, I don't just mean the processes that are part of your day-to-day operation that enable you to trade effectively. I'm also talking about the legal requirements that you'll have to meet in order to be able to trade properly anyway. So things like all the health and safety and environmental regulations, as well as the general data protection regulations, the GDPR ones. So absolutely really critical there. And I know Stella will be talking to us about that area specifically following my little presentation here, just to make sure that you're really clued up and key on what those specific regulations and legal commitments are, so that under the current circumstances, you don't find yourself cutting corners or getting yourself into difficulties as a result of not meeting those legal requirements too. Customers, really critical, lifeblood of the business. What you need to be doing is making sure, and I'm sure you will have been doing this already, staying in contact with them, sharing information about your status, and also gleaning information about theirs, so that you can see what opportunities there might be for you to continue to support those customers and trade with them wherever possible. And if not now, be able to resume that at the earliest opportunity as the situation rolls out with the relaxation of some of the lockdown restrictions. But it's not just customers, employees, and all those critical processes. There are a variety of other things that are key to your business running successfully. Having a robust and consistent supply chain is also really important, and making sure that not just the suppliers, but all of those other stakeholders in terms of your finance support, accountants, bookkeepers, banks, insurance companies, and all of the likes are kept in touch and in tune with your situation, so that there are no misunderstandings moving forward and that you can move off that quickly. So just 4 key areas to really look at in terms of how well is the business set up with this? Have you been doing all the right things? And what other things might you need to be doing in order to be able to get the business back on its feet again quickly when the time comes. Next slide, Paul. Thank you. So in summary, because I've thrown quite a lot of information at you there, there's sort of 5 key things to really focus on doing. So we talked about prioritizing people's safety and their continual engagement, keeping that workforce happy, close to you, engaged and ready to go. Looking out into the future, what does that new normal look like? What are some of those key threats, and what strategies do you now need to be evolving and developing that will help your business cope with that uncertain future as we move into it and it starts to evolve? How quickly can we adapt to those changes? How agile do we need to be? And what are the sorts of things that we need to be set up so that we're able to cope with that situation much more smoothly? Keeping your stakeholders and all of those other organisations that you need to successfully run your business communicated and understanding about you and likewise with your situation, but also, as Mike and Peter have talked about before, really capitalise on those business support grants, business support schemes, and all of those things that will help to enable the business to survive through these unprecedented times. You know, investigate them and get those applications in, because every little bit can make a big difference. So that collectively together, what you can do is start to build the resilience of your business so you're better placed to be able to cope with whatever the future might hold. And the more time you can sort of try to understand what that might look like, the better prepared you're going to be in terms of being able to deal with it. So next slide. Thanks, Paul. Right, so having said all that, what then I'd really like to be encouraging you to do is to, if you haven't done already, start to put together a bit of a simple business continuity plan. And the way that it works, the sort of stages that you need to go through are on this slide here. So first and foremost, what you would do would be to assess the threats that the business might face. So in a normal situation where we're looking out ahead, we would be wanting to sort of say, so what sort of things might cause the business some difficulty? And the list that I've identified there under threats are some of the typical ones that we would often consider when doing this sort of planning. The greatest threat more often comes from natural disasters, so floods, fires, storms, hurricanes, that sort of thing. Secondly, and not so far behind, our disease. Primarily the biggest threat, certainly to UK businesses around disease, is a major influenza outbreak around the winter months, which could infect significant numbers of your team and therefore paralyse the business in terms of not being able to have a full workforce available to you. In the case of Covid-19, we've most probably got a situation which is tenfold worse than that, with all of the government restrictions and the deaths that are associated with that as well. So really, really severe situation around that particular thing. Some of the others I've just identified there for information, but we would start with the disease and the COVID situation as being the first threat to focus in on. Having identified a particular threat, what we then do is look at the impact that it might have on the business, and there can be a number of different situations or scenarios, as we call them, that we can have a look at. And fundamentally, we're trying to identify the extent and the nature of the damage to the business that threat might be able to cause, and in particular, what aspects of the business might be affected and which of those will be critical to its operation. And where we can't prevent them, how might we then recover critical processes that are lost or critical functions that are lost that could then be recovered and put back in place again as quickly as we possibly could. So with that knowledge and understanding, the threat and the impact that it can have on us, in particular those areas of vulnerability, what we then need to do is look at, well, what are we going to do about that? So initially, we'd be looking at setting up a system for prevention of the things that we might be able to do to prevent it. Well, we as a business couldn't stop COVID-19 coming in, but we might be able to prevent our staff from getting it. So there are actions that might come out from that in terms of PPE, home working, all of the sort of measures that you're seeing being put in place. What sort of resources might we need in order to do that? What sort of processes or procedures might we need to put in place to help us to be able to deal with it? So are the sort of key questions that we're wanting to put in place, because with that knowledge and insight, we're now going to be in a position where we can be much more resilient in terms of dealing with these threats for the future. So moving on to the next slide. Thanks, Paul. What we can see is that there are 5 stages associated with putting a business continuity plan in place. So for those of you who have been watching in previous drop-in sessions, I'm hopeful that some of you may have already started on this process, and each session I go into a little bit more detail on each of the stages, just to help you step by step work your way through this particular cycle of activities with a view that you'll end up with a half-decent plan at the end of it. So first step is analysis. So it's looking at the impact or the threat and the consequential impact that might come through. So we're looking at each of the different threats, assessing the impact, and starting to identify what things we might need to do. And from that, we can build up this list of prevention and recovery actions that form the requirement for us then developing the solutions. So step 2, that's solution design, where we're looking particularly at those critical functions in the business with a view to focusing on dealing with them. Don't worry about the other stuff. If it's not critical, it can wait. Let's just make sure we focus on the stuff that really, really matters. And the second thing is how quickly we need to make that recovery. So some of the solutions need to keep the speed of recovery in mind as part of moving forward. So having done the analysis, got some solutions in place, we need to implement them. We then need to test them to make sure they actually work, but also get that workforce buy-in, that acceptance, that understanding that they're in place, and that they would be picked up and adopted and used when an emergency or a crisis hits. And then the 5th stage is just about maintaining and keeping them up to date, with a view that we would have an annual review where we then go through and just check that the threats and the impact assessments are still valid and that things haven't changed or evolved on from there. So it's a cyclical thing where once you've created your plan, you keep on top of it year in, year out. When it's needed, and these things often come very quickly and unexpectedly, it's in place and you've time to be able to start to put things in place that without having spent this time creating these things, you're not likely to have got sufficient time available to you to really protect your business properly. So what I'm going to do now in the next slide, Paul, is just quickly touch on what was involved in the analysis. We spent a moment last time looking at that, but just by way of a refresher. So we put together, and this is just a very, very simple Excel spreadsheet, a simple table. We identify a particular threat and maybe a scenario around it, and we would list up all of the risks that we would associate with that particular type of threat. We can then assess those risks in terms of the impact and the likelihood that, that we might expect to see with them, and any early warning signs that we could look out for that buy us that little bit of time that they might be on the way. List up the necessary actions that we would need to consider in terms of dealing with them, and then come up with this list of recovery, prevention or recovery requirements that we can prioritize around those critical functions, and therefore gives us a real good insight as to those particular things that we most need to be worried about, because they're the things that could do damage to our business in the future. So on the next slide, we can then look at that next step, which is looking at the recovery requirements and starting to identify some solutions. So if we could have the next slide, Paul. Thank you. So solution design fundamentally is about identifying the most cost-effective solutions to adopt for prevention and recovery. And the way that you go about doing that is you brainstorm out a series of ideas in terms of potential solutions, and then you select the most cost-effective one, particularly considering the recovery time that might be needed. The last thing you want to do is tie up a whole load of resources, including cash, on stuff that is just going to be sat around in a cupboard doing nothing in case of an emergency in the future. We need to keep that to an absolute minimum, but we still need to make sure that the solutions that we're identifying are really, really going to be effective and make all the difference. More often than not, the first idea that you come up with as a solution isn't the best one. So this whole process is really just thinking through a number of ideas and choosing the best one that you possibly can, that will enable you, wherever possible, to protect or prevent that risk having a high impact on you, but where it does, then to be able to recover from it quickly and within a time that is important for your business to be able to be back up and running and trading again. So that then takes us on to implementation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that next time. But for those of you who are putting your plans together as you go, that's the thing I'd like you to concentrate on this week, building upon the impact and threat assessments that you've been working on last week. So on the next slide, just wanted to touch very, very briefly on the Humber Business Growth Hub support. A really, really important asset for you, something that has got a lot of support, not just in terms of the financial schemes, but each of the local council areas in the Humber have got their own dedicated team of business advisors. So if you were to go on the humbergrowthhub.org website, you can go and look at the web page for business advisors, advisor-overview, and by clicking on the council area that you're in, that will then take you through to the business advisors for you to be able to discuss any issues with them. It's free of charge to you. They're there to support you. Use them to the full. There's some fantastic experienced people there just waiting to help you. But in addition to that, there are a variety of different schemes. Again, on the COVID-19 web page of the Humber Business Growth Hub.org website, you will see these schemes and more that are available to help you. So for example, at the moment, where a lot of businesses are trying to set up their staff working from home who need laptops, other communication information, there is a grant to support them, which is the ICT grant, 40% grant, up to £1,000 for £2,500 worth of investment. So if you're investing in equipment, or you're wanting to invest in equipment, these aren't retrospective, so you need to get in contact with them, get an application form, get it sent in, and if that's approved, then that will give you 40% of the cost, up to £1,000 for that sort of equipment. If you're wanting to do some business continuity planning and you need to work with a consultant or an expert who can help you with that to really improve the resilience of your business, there's a scheme there in order to help you to do that, again with a support on it. There is the Finance for Growth scheme, which is again complementing the various other business loan schemes that are around, as well as the Small Business Grant Fund. Now, this is the scheme that Peter talked about earlier, where if you have property or premises and you're paying business rates, or you are claiming on the business rate relief scheme, then there is a grant available to you there for £10,000. I know at the moment there are a number of businesses that haven't yet put in an application for that, and I think in some cases it's because they should have been applying for or receiving the business rate relief, and if they're not on that scheme because they've not been claiming when they should be, then they'll not be contacted by the councils. So you need to just, if you think that's you need to contact the council and just speak to them so that you can see whether you should be on that. I do know some companies that weren't on it that should have been, are now just claiming for that relief and are getting some money back that they were entitled to. And once they've received that, they'll then be in a position to be able to put in an application claim for this. So if you haven't heard anything, check it out anyway if you think that that is something that should apply to you. And all these schemes complement and add to the schemes that are nationally available that have already been discussed. So good luck with your business continuity planning. I wish you well with that. I hope that you'll come back next week and we can look at the further stages of putting your plan together. Over to you, Paul.
That's great. Thank you very much, Steve. Quite a comprehensive overview there and a good overview of the local support available as well. I'm now going to pass you on to Stella Jacobs to talk about GDPR. If you're anything like my business, you've had to adapt to becoming a remote-based business almost overnight, to manage your employees remotely, to manage your customer bases and supply chain remotely. Very important to perhaps stop now after a couple of weeks of doing this and review whether or not your data protection policies are in line with and where they should be. So I'll hand you now over to Stella Jacobs to talk you through her session. Thank you, Stella.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, as the COVID-19 pandemic continues, for most of us, it probably feels a bit like a dystopian experiment, doesn't it? Working from home in a safe environment is widespread. It's not just in the UK. And there is a great deal of personal data that would previously have been confined to business premises and business systems is now being accessed and processed in your employees' homes. Some businesses and their employees are very confused and unaware really of some of the laws and policies about remote working. And it's quite a minefield, so it can easily go wrong. Data protection is essential. Compliance is essential, and the ICOs are still enforcing it, so it's really important to promote good knowledge and understanding amongst all of your staff on how the technical and organisational safeguards are affected. Having a greater awareness, so having setting your procedures, having some policies in place will really help to keep the business safe during this time. And also really letting your employees know what they should and shouldn't be doing. So I'll be going through quite a few ideas which will give you some tips and tricks on it. Just a bit of a reminder that before I get into that about GDPR itself and what Article 5 states, and this is obviously what you need to control. So it says that data shall only be processed in a manner which is fair and lawful, only used for the manner in which it was intended to be used, processed in a manner which is adequate, relevant, and not excessive. Obviously, it needs to be accurate and kept up to date, that it's not kept for any longer than it was intended, that it's processed in accordance to the rights of the people, and so that they actually know what the data is about. It's protected by technical and organisational security measures, which I'll be talking about. and it's not really transferred to any third countries outside the EU, which do not guarantee adequate measure of data protection. And if I can just say, it's known currently is the EU GDPR, but things will obviously change at the end of the year and beginning of next year. So any policies that you have that say EU GDPR, look out for the correction on that. Paul, can I have the next slide, please? And after that, thank you. So you'll see there are two columns here. One's got, well, they've both got data safety, equipment and communication, and I'll talk about those in a moment. There are some working policies which every employer needs to have in place. Absolutely, every employer needs to have in place. May I have the next slide, please? Okay. So the HR function within the business is responsible for producing the first two of these policies. So that's the home working policy and the home worker agreement letter. So the HR department will probably have those done for you. And the management will be looking through the home worker risk assessment, which is something that I think Steve just talked on about recently. What your business really needs to look at is both the BYOD and remote access policy. BYOD stands for bring your own device, and the data protection home working policy. And these are the two that relate to GDPR. May I have the next slide, please? So there are some essential parts of this policy. The policy statement explains what the policy is for. It outlines the measures and gives employees clear guidelines on what they can, but more importantly, what they can't and shouldn't be doing. The scope in this refers to the policy that it applies to. So it applies to all the staff within the company. That means permanent, fixed, temporary staff, third-party representatives, subcontractors, agency workers, volunteers, apprentices, and even agents that are engaged with a company in the UK or overseas. So that's what the scope means. Guidelines and protocol sets out what the employee needs to do to make sure the updates are implemented, that, for instance, screens are locked, that they have their cameras turned off and microphones when they're not being used, that they're doing encryption and they're removing data and things when they really have to, when it's not necessary for them to use it anymore. Then we look at remote access protocols, and this is when not so relevant at this point now, but still useful to have in this policy, which, by the way, you can either see online, you can get quite easily online, or if you email in, we can probably send out some forms for you later on. So at the Humber Business Growth Hub know, and we can do that for you. Yeah, so the remote access protocol is about when other people are using your equipment or internet or servers. And there's also using and securing remote access responsibilities, which obviously are quite self-explanatory. And you really need to look at these because it is a mandatory policy if people are working from home. The data protection policy for home working. Sorry, could I have the next slide, please, Paul? Sorry. So this is what the data protection for home working, or the data protection home working policy, whatever you prefer to call it, it's a detailed document. It builds on your standard data protection policy that you should already have in place. But what this one does, it adds a number of really useful provisions, making it more suitable for adoption of home working. So under normal circumstances, the handling of personal data by staff working from home is not really desirable. But data protection compliance obviously needs to adapt during this current situation. So, you know, we're bending the rules slightly because we need to there are far more people working at home now than was ever expected. So within your current data protection policy, you will have all of these that are listed here. So data protection principles, going further down, consent, the accuracy of the data, all of those, data subject access, which actually is one thing I'm going to be doing with you next week, because that's really important for employees to know what's going on with that. So it's one of the topics for next week. Then further down at the bottom of the slide, restriction of personal data. So all of these should be already in your current data policy that you have. Next slide, please, Paul. We're racing through these, aren't we? So you'll also have the data portability, ejections, and all of those transferring and implementation policy. Where you'll notice there's going to be a difference, these are the ones that are in bold. And these are the ones that you might have already, but within these sections, they need to refer to home working. So for instance, the personal data that you've collected, held and processed, you need to refer to how that's being done with home workers. So you need to refer to the software that's being used, if that's how it's being saved. You need to refer how the employees are keeping it safe as well. Obviously how it's being transferred through personal data and communications, things might have changed. You might be transferring through, I don't know, some channels such as Slack or various other things. So that needs to be talked about. Most definitely you need to mention IT security. That's a big must. IT security at home is going to be very different to how it is in the office. And I'm going to be talking about that in a moment and some of the things you can really look out for. But that must be referred to in the policy as the storage of the data, where that's being held. Is it being held on people's home computers? Hopefully not. And then how are you disposing it? You know, people are working at home, they've got files on their desks. Do they really need those files? Are they still there? And how are they're shredding that paper once they've read it? So all of that really needs to come into it. And then data security about why you're using it, why you actually need to have that data while you're working at home. And a big one that hopefully won't, but is more easy to go wrong really, is your data breach notification. So your employees must know what to do and what happens should a data breach occur. And this is much more common when at home than in the office, because people get lapse. It's just one of those things that we all do. So in a nutshell, they're the two main policies that you need. You need your BYOD and remote working policy, and you need your general data policy for home working. And there are different things in both of them. And again, if you can't get access to them via the internet, then I'm sure we can certainly send them out for you. Once you've got those policies, obviously make sure that your employees have them, they've signed them, they understand them, they've returned it back to you, and you're keeping it for future reference. You must keep it for future reference. If the ICO, that's the Information Commissioner's Office, comes knocking, they're going to want proof that the staff have seen these and that they're working towards them. It might also be helpful, although this isn't mandatory, but it might be helpful for you to do a how do I guide. So for the staff to know, you know, how do they log into things, who do they contact, what do they need to do. So just a bit of a, you know, a one-pager for them. Don't assume they know what they need to do. You know, this has all come about so quickly, and these policies have just come about so quickly. You know, one minute they're at the office, the next minute they're not, but they might not know what to do. So, you know, so don't assume that they do. Right, so that's the policies covered with. So that's the part from the employers, really. Now, actually, let's look at what some of the employees need to do. May I have the next slide, please, Paul? Thank you. So this area is really going to look at the working environment and some of the threats that you've got. It's not all about employees, because obviously some employers might be working from home as well. So it's for all of you really. So shall I just say home workers? I think that might be much better. So within the home office environment, I'm only really talking about this from data protection and where the breaches could possibly happen. And breaches tend to come from two main areas really. Foremost is the hackers. We try and stay ahead of the hackers as much as possible. All the breaches come from the company itself through someone having made a mistake or something having not been backed up properly. So they're the two main areas. And it's really important to only let the staff have access to the data that they need to have access to. They don't need to look at all the other stuff. For instance, HR would probably need to access most of the things. But if somebody's working in the marketing department, they don't need to have access to other bits and pieces. So just think about who you're giving access of the information to, and do they really need it, especially with working from home. Think about the software that you're using on your systems as well. For instance, if you're using 365 for everything, and if that gets hacked, then those hackers will have access to everything. So, you know, don't keep all your emails and all your backups and all your other paperwork and everything on one system. Have different software packages for different things, so that should you get hacked, and hopefully you won't, they can't have access to absolutely everything. Steve's already touched on this, and this is a good point to bring this up again. Have a look at what your employees that are working from home actually need. You know, do they need a laptop? Do they need a new laptop that, you know, you could probably now get a grant for? Obviously, they're going to need telephones and particular types of software. And this is going to vary really from job to job. So, you know, think about what they really need to have and, you know, help them out with it. We're here for the long haul. I don't just think it's going to be a few weeks. And if they keep talking about spikes as they do, you know, we might be back in this position later in the year. So it's really important for you to enable your workforce to have the equipment and the security of the equipment that they need. Where possible, don't let them use their own devices. If something goes wrong, who's going to be liable for that? Is it going to be you? Is it going to be the employees? They're going to say, well, it wouldn't have broken if I hadn't been using your system. So just try and think about getting them something different. And this isn't a plug for Mac or anyone, by the way. Obviously, don't let other members of the family share the devices. That's really important. Try and have your own work area away from the rest of the family. It's lovely if you've got your own office environment, but if you haven't, if you are stuck on the end of the dining table, just make sure that's your end of the dining table and people just can't come past and look at what you're doing. You know, as at work, you probably have a clear desk policy. We'll see if you can try and implement that at home as well. And just think about that if you're working with confidential information in a paper format, just think about how you can keep that safe, and think about, you know, have you got a cabinet you can put it into when you're not working on it? Think about where it's actually being stored. You know, are there locks in the cabinets? And ideally, we'd like them, we can't always have them, but just make sure that you are keeping things safe, because again, this really should go into policy. Also try and advise employees that under no circumstances should they produce any manual or electronic copies of files, and they shouldn't leave anything that can be seen by anyone else. And also think about sensitive data. You know, how are you actually sending that? Is it through your own personal email accounts, like Gmail, for instance? Or, you know, you're sending files through Slack or through something else? The onus is really on you to remind staff not to do that. If they don't do it in the workplace, then why should they do it at home? And obviously, as at work, when they're away from their computer, make sure that the lock screen is on. And then think about video conferencing. You know, Zoom is the new thing. Not quite sure what happened to Skype. That's sort of gone off, isn't it, really? But Zoom is the new thing, and it's brilliant for keeping in touch. But think about in the background what people can see. Is there any data? Is there anything that can identify anyone that can be seen? And also remind staff that it's not always secure. It's got a lot better, and it is fairly secure, but just make sure that they are in control of who's watching them, who's on the screen, you know, that they haven't had somebody else dial into the call. So just be a little bit mindful of what's happening. And also if they're having, you know, a business conversation on their computer, make sure they can't be overheard by anyone else in the company or even overlooked. You know, it's a big thing. Right, so we've talked a little bit about backing up, sorry. Backup. So most people don't really know how to back up. The system at work just does it automatically. So now people are at home, how are they actually backing up? You know, obviously it still needs to go to the computer systems and not to their own systems. So think about how you're doing that. And with your own backups, have you actually tested how long it takes for something to come back to you, how it actually takes? Because most people haven't. Most people think, you know, oh well, it's backed up. You know, if I need it, it's there. But very often, if you've got a lot of information, it can take hours and hours and hours. So, you know, think about this during the risk assessment that Steve talked about as well. And a lot of people are using Dropbox. Don't have this as your only source of backup. It is safe. It does split all the information into different parts. But don't have this as your only source. You should really have at least 2 or 3 methods of backing up and where it goes to. I mentioned hackers earlier. They are out there, they're on the streets. They're probably the ones that are driving around, and they can get into home security systems because they're not as strong as the ones at work. So think about your internet and what you've got on it. Phishing is the easiest way for hackers to get into your system, and it accounts for really one of the highest percentages of data breaches that happen. So, you know, have a look at who your email is from. You know, look at that email address, just check the validity of the email address. And, you know, before you click on anything at all, just really think twice, because your data protection is probably not as good as the one at work. So just really, really make sure that you are keeping people's data safe. The cyber team, the prevention team at Humberside Police, have said that there are many more email scams that are linked to coronavirus, and that the hackers are really sort of jumping on this. They're trying to get people to, you know, click on a link. I mean, I'd like to quote them. It actually says, cyber criminals are preying on fears of the coronavirus and sending phishing emails and try to trick users into clicking on a bad link. Once clicked, the user is sent a dodgy website which could download malware. And what they're doing really is just preying on you. You know, could you please send some money to Major Tom? You know, he's done an amazing job, and you just click on it automatically without really checking it out. So just be a little bit wary of that. And think about, could you possibly use a VPN, which is a virtual private network? A lot of people use them, obviously, if they're out and about at Starbucks. I wish we could go back there, but not right now. But a lot of people do use them. But have you considered using one at work, at home? It might be much easier, because it still means that you can access your organisation's remote IT resources, but it encrypts everything as well. And obviously think about your Wi-Fi and using strong passwords. Obviously not giving those passwords to any friends or other members of the family. Try and always use a 2-factor authentication where possible. Encryption, actually, I want to cover next week, as I do really strong passwords. So if it isn't a strong password, please log in again next week, and I'll tell you a bit about that. And thinking about firewalls as well. Employees really must have firewalls on them, all their devices. And if they suspect a data breach, report it immediately. installed software must be kept up to date. If you get a login for it, then just, you know, please phone through and just let somebody know that you've had a problem with it. And then next week, I also want to carry on about routers as well and talk to you about routers, because changing those is really important. Right, may I have the next slide, please? Okay. So things happen, things go wrong. When it does, don't panic. Please don't panic. Really think about what's happened. Let others know so that you can understand what's happened on it, so that new measures can be put in place, and so that other members can actually be highlighted to the same mistake that you've done. So just thinking ahead then, so next week I'll be talking about strong passwords, encryption, DSARS data subjects, DPIAs, and if you want anything else, just let the Humber Business Growth know, and I'll put those through as well. So thank you very much. Hope you found some of that interesting. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Stella, for that overview. We'll look forward to next week's coverage as well. Moving swiftly on, I'm going to pass you straight now over to Kelly to talk to us about furlough and also HR matters generally. So over to you. Thank you, Kelly.
Hi, everybody. Hope you're all keeping well. Okay, so if you can move across to the next slide, Paul, that would be great. Cheers. Okay, so really just wanted to cover off again some of the kind of common questions that we've been asked this week. To start off with, accessing the job retention scheme, as both Peter and Mike have already covered off, the scheme is now live, and they've kind of covered off the technicalities of how you can access that. And one thing I do want to add is that the scheme is open to obviously organisations who have operations impacted by COVID-19 and don't have work for staff. But you can also use the scheme if you have employees that are shielding, so if they have a shielding letter that prevents them from coming to work, or if you have staff that have caring responsibilities, so again they have difficulties with kind of working remotely or coming to work, you can also use the job retention scheme for those people. So moving through the questions, do I need to get employees to agree to furlough? The simple answer to this is yes, you do. The best way to do this is really to get it in writing. So send a letter to staff that you're going to furlough explaining sort of the dates that they're going to be furloughed and that they will only be receiving 80% of their salary within that time frame. It's also good to kind of point out to them that they will need to make themselves available for work as and when required by the company, and it will be under regular review. So that at the end of that initial 3 weeks, you can either continue with furlough or bring them back to work. That letter that you send to them, keep a copy of it on file, and it is good practice to keep that for 5 years, okay? You don't necessarily need to get a written response back from them, confirm that they've accepted it, but you do need to have a copy of a letter to say that you've sent them information and confirm that they're going to be furloughed in that period. Do I have to pay 100% of wages in order to claim through the job retention scheme? No, you don't. You only have to pay 80% of wages, which is capped at 2,500. You can opt to top that payment up each month if you want to. So if you do opt to top that up, whether that's to 100% of salary or 90% of salary, we've heard from different people throughout the week that have applied different approaches to this. You can do that. You can also choose to, we have one client who sort of chose to, for the first 3 weeks of furlough, top that payment up to 100%, but actually any further furlough would be at the 80%. So you can actually do different things with this, but the important thing really is to keep staff updated and communicate with them and confirm to them as to what you will be doing, okay? And obviously do that in writing and keep copies of it on their personnel files. Can I rotate employees that are on furlough? Yes, you can, and this is really good practice if you are in the position to be able to do it. One thing to remember here is that you need to furlough for a minimum of 3 weeks. So anybody who's placed on furlough, it has to be for 3 weeks or more. So in order to rotate staff, you could potentially split your workforce into Group A and Group B. So for the first 3 weeks, Group A work and Group B are furloughed, and then you can kind of switch that around. Again, as you do this, make sure that you're writing to people, that you're keeping them updated, and that you've got that copies of that as it's placed on their personnel files. Can employees undertake any work while on furlough? So basically, depending on their situation, the answer to this question sort of changes. The employee cannot undertake any work for the employer that has furloughed them. So if you have an employee who has one employer and you furlough them, they cannot undertake any work for you during that period. Okay, they can undertake training. If somebody does undertake training and you have reduced their salary down to 80%, you have to ensure that for the hours they're undertaking training, they do receive the equivalent of sort of national minimum wage or national living wage, whatever is relevant to their age group, okay, for the time that they spend training. If you have an employee who has two jobs, so you employ them and are employed by another, if you furlough them, they can actually still work for that other employer, okay? The other scenario is that if you have an employee and they ask that during that period of furlough, they perhaps take up other employment to top up their money, you can allow them to do that. So again, I would put that in writing to say you're allowing them to sort of take up alternative work while they're on that period of furlough, but also state that once that period of furlough is ended, they do need to make themselves available to be your employee again, okay? So their terms and conditions, etc., would still all be in place, and they would still need to make sure that they can meet their contractual obligations with yourself. Can annual leave be taken at the same time as furlough? Yes, it can. So employees can ask to take annual leave during this period. If somebody does ask to take annual leave during this period, then make sure that their wage is topped up to their normal salary, okay? So it has to happen if they're taking a period of annual leave. Do I need a home working policy for temporary working from home? It is really good practice to have this in place. As Stella has already touched on, there are lots of implications around home working, and GDPR and security is one of them. It's also good to have something in place, so a home working policy to kind of set out, you know, what the company will provide, what expenses will be catered for. So for example, if you are going to pick up utility bill costs or internet telephone costs, that type of thing, it's really good to have a home working policy that kind of sets all that out. It's also good to kind of have something that gives guidelines on how that person will be managed and how the communication between them and their line manager will be handled. So yeah, it is good practice to have a home working policy in place. Another common question that we faced this week is around redundancies and when should I start consultation? The job retention scheme has now been extended until June, so it's now for 4 months. With regards to consultation periods in relation to making redundancies, it does matter depending on the amount of people that you're making redundant. 20 employees or less, there isn't a legal requirement to consult, but it is good practice. I think especially given the current climate, it is always good to consult with staff, and that is involving sort of one-to-one or group consultations, okay? If it's 20 or more employees that you're making redundant, then if it's up to 99, it's for 30 days that you need to consult. If it's 99 employees or more, it's 45 days that you need to consult. So that consultation period needs to be concluded before any redundancy can be made, okay? One thing that I would stress at this point is that the job retention scheme has been put in place as a way to kind of mitigate and avoid redundancies. So where possible, you know, use that scheme to its full potential. If you do find that you are in a situation where you are considering making redundancies, it is really key that you kind of consider, okay, are there alternatives before you embark on that journey? So that could be things like redeployment, looking at kind of working practices. Can you reduce working hours? You know, can you ask for voluntary redundancies? So perhaps go out to your workforce and say, is there anybody who wants to volunteer to be made redundant? Or potentially, again, looking at kind of the demographics of your workforce. Do you have potentially older people who would be interested in potentially early retirement? So, you know, really do explore the alternatives to redundancy before you embark on any kind of redundancy plan. And one thing I would say as well is to make sure that you do seek advice if you do go down that route. It is an option that needs very careful planning. and it can lead to a lot of different kind of employment law claims if you get it wrong. So really do make sure that you seek the advice and guidance, that you plan any redundancy process out properly from the outset. If anybody has any kind of questions and anything that I've covered there, please feel free to kind of add them on the questions section, and we can cover them off at the end of the presentations. If you can move on to the next slide, please, Paul. I'm really conscious of time, and that Rachel has still got her piece to do around mental well-being, and I think that's really key. So I'm just kind of really quickly going to go through these next 2 slides and hand over to Rachel. So hints and tips on managing teams remotely. I think, again, you know, choose one communication platform, and as kind of Stella has touched on, kind of the security aspects of this again are really key. Make sure that you have a common space to share documents. Again, bear in mind the GDPR and the security aspects on this as well. From a kind of a people element, set goals and priorities so that people stay focused. And it is really key to give regular feedback to people, so that it is a 2-way process. When people are working remotely and they're constantly feeding in, they need to have that feedback so that they know that what they're doing is adding value and the contribution is valued. So it is really key to keep that link going. Trust people, let them work to their own schedules, as we kind of touched on over the last couple of weeks. I think now, as we're coming into week 3, people are kind of starting to find those routines, and it's becoming a little bit easier, but it still is difficult trying to juggle life, childcare, caring responsibilities with working remotely. Have that set time from formal meetings over coffee, so that people can break their working day up. It's not just all about work, but there is that kind of downtime that people would naturally get in an office environment. Try to encourage that kind of ethos of, you know, working how you want to, just don't let anybody down. So really kind of, you know, tie that into this kind of setting priorities and goals and giving that feedback. And also, you know, keep that communication from the top down and be honest around how sort of COVID-19 is affecting the business and what that potentially will look like in the future. And if you can move on to the next slide, please, Paul. Communication is key. I think, you know, don't forget about your furloughed employees. Make sure that you are keeping that communication up with them. Just a phone call, you know, hey, how are you doing? Make sure that you're kind of creating that space for everybody to plug into, so your furloughed employees and your people that may be working remotely, around kind of working to new schedules and kind of the mental well-being, which again Rachel will cover off. Provide that space for kind of the meet and greets for everybody to be involved in, again those furloughed employees as well as those working remotely. I've heard some great examples this week of people that have tried to involve families, so have quizzes, perhaps have competitions for, you know, children to get involved in, so pictures of the week, set a theme, you know, who can draw the best space picture, for example, and, you know, really try to embrace that whole kind of family scenario and get everybody involved. Try and have you know, an updated Q&A around regular questions that are being asked by your workforce that again everybody can access, so that people are kept up to date with how different scenarios will be managed. Ask for feedback. I think now, you know, as we enter into kind of week 3 and 4 of this, it's really important to ask for feedback from your kind of your furloughed staff, but also your remote workers on what's working well and what's not working well. You know, we don't think that this is going to end soon. So as much learning as we can do now and as many changes as we can get in place to support people, the better. So really do ask for that feedback. And I think as well, it just kind of, you know, start thinking about what does returning to work look like. And as we go on through the weeks, we'll kind of start adding more to this. But that kind of, what does returning to work look like? And generally in relation to, you know, how is it going to impact people's job roles and responsibilities? How is it going to impact the overall structure of your organisation? And what do you need to start looking at in terms of employment policies and procedures? You know, how are you going to embrace this kind of new way of working? So again, as I said, we'll cover more on that as we go through the coming weeks, but just really conscious of time, so I'll hand over to Rachel now.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kelly. Yeah, we are running slightly tight on time, but we will make sure we get through all of this next section with Rachel. So yeah, without further ado, Rachel, straight over to you. 1 second.
Unmuted.
Okay.
Thanks, Paul. Let me just
Move the slide on. Brilliant. Hi everybody, my name is Rachel Alexander. I'm a workplace mental health psychologist, and I'm going to be talking to you about protecting your mental health and your employees' mental health during these uncertain times. So if you'd like to move the slide ahead, Paul, please. So I'm going to be talking to you about why focusing on mental health is important right now. Obviously, focusing on mental health is really important for your employees, whatever the time of year it is and whatever's going on, but clearly there's more important at the moment. How to manage mental health in others, probably more importantly, how to manage mental health in yourself, and then just talking about a couple of other workshops that will be able to really embed the basic understanding that I'm going to give you today. So move on, please, Paul. So why mental health is essential to business. Again, I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to try and cover this as quick as I can. First of all, lots of research out there showing that those with positive mental health has a positive effect on business productivity. So just to be clear, just to sort of like clear up what mental health is just the way that we think, feel and behave. Often when we hear about mental health, we just think of one end of the scale of mental health, which is anxiety, depression, suicide. But it's not just about that. It's so important to have staff who are thinking, feeling and behaving in really positive ways. And as Steve said in his presentation, you know, your workforce is your greatest asset. So what we want to do is make sure that our assets are thinking, feeling and behaving in as much as a positive way as possible, so that they're fit for purpose, the job gets done, etc., which I'm going to cover as we go through the presentation. So we do have a legal responsibility to look after the mental health in our staff, and I'm going to be talking about that later on. It's an act of empowerment to help your staff understand how to take responsibility for their mental health. So as a manager, empowering our teams is so important to look after their mental health. And you know, the final thing on that list, which should maybe be the first thing, is at the end of the day, it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do to look after the mental health, or to help your teams look after their mental health. And a poll done by ACAS showed that 73% of employees think it is a manager's role to recognise and address the stress and anxiety that they may be feeling. So I'm going to expand more into that as we move on. So next slide, please, Paul. So how mental health affects business productivity, I'll say once again, all mental health is how we think, feel and behave. So a study was done by CIPD, and they took some staff who were struggling with their mental health, and they said, okay, how does it affect you when you're trying to do your job? And as we can see there, 85% said that they had difficulty in concentrating. It takes longer to do tasks, difficulty making decisions, difficulty in juggling a number of tasks, less patient with customers and clients, putting off challenging work, and more likely to get into conflict with others. So this is why, as business owners, we really need to be prioritising looking after the mental health and well-being of our staff. Next slide, please, Paul. Okay, so, you know, over the sort of like last 15 years that I've been involved in working with organisations about mental health, what I see is quite a lot of fear in company owners and managers not wanting to talk mental health. And when you sort of like get down to what this is about, it's simply fear that they think they're going to open a can of worms. So if they have a conversation with a staff member about mental health, they're unsure about what they're going to get and what they're going to have to do to sort out the issues that the staff member may be struggling with. And it's not about that at all. You know, what we've got to remember is company owners, managers, supervisors, you are not God, you are not a counsellor, you are not a therapist. It is not up to you to solve the mental health problems of your staff. It is up to you to create a space to enable them to be addressed and to then move through them. So I'll talk about that as we go through. Next slide, please, Paul. Okay, so what we're really talking about is when we help staff manage their mental health, we're helping the employees to help you. So hopefully what you've got so far from my presentation is that the better the mental health is in a staff member, the more clearly they are able to think, feel and behave. So if you've got staff members that are thinking, feeling and behaving in non-stressful ways, in more positive ways, it means that they're going to be able to focus on the job, and they're going to be able to focus on the tasks. They're going to be able to prioritize the tasks. They're going to think of solutions. They're going to be innovative. They're going to be creative. So this is why it's so important as employers to help staff manage their mental well-being. Next slide, please, Paul. Okay, so let's look at what's going on during COVID and why it's such an important time to be helping staff. So I think, you know, a lot of people are feeling a lot of different things, but the one thing that we can probably all say that we're feeling is uncertain. And when we feel uncertain, we're into the realms of the unknown. And one thing that human beings do not like, we do not like the unknown, because we like to be in control, we like to know what's happening. And that's why we all tend to have comfort zones. So we all have habits, routine, you know, the ways that we live. We get probably up at the same time, we have similar things for breakfast, we travel the same way to work, we do our job correctly, we get home, we watch the same programs, hang out with the same people. That's because we like our comfort zones, because it doesn't trigger any fear or anxiety, because we know what's happening. And that's why often you get people staying in quite difficult situations, such as bad marriages or not particularly happy with their job, because they're comfortable in the pain. At least they know what's happening. So COVID has absolutely brought on a load of uncertainty for a lot of people. Is my job secure? Am I going to have a job to go back to? You know, am I going to get the illness? Are my kids going to be okay? Are they going to be struggling because they're not at school, etc.? So we've got a lot of uncertainty. Next slide, please, Paul. And so when we have uncertainty, what happens to ourselves is we start to worry, we get a lot of anger, feel tension, a lot of pressure, we can feel overwhelmed, a lot of fear, which may create anxiety, panic attacks, a lot of emotion affecting relationships, and that might affect the sleep. So we've got a lot of staff members out there that, because they're uncertain, it's creating a lot of stress into them. Next slide, please, Paul. So, okay, so where does stress originate from? So keeping this diagram very simple, we basically have two parts of our brain. We have an emotional part of our brain and we have a prefrontal cortex part of our brain. And whatever data we get into us, whatever our eyes see or our ears hear, it immediately gets processed by the emotional brain. So what's happening at the moment is there's so much uncertainty that the emotional brain is processing all this uncertainty. And how it processes is it releases hormones of adrenaline and cortisol into our bloodstream. So when we've got adrenaline and cortisol being increased into our bloodstream, that means we can't think logically. So to think about it for yourself, imagine when maybe you've had an argument with somebody and you've reacted in a really inappropriate way, and then as soon as the argument has disappeared, a more logical way of thinking has come over you, and you thought, well, that was maybe a bit silly that I slammed out of that door, or I sent that email with those curse words in, or whatever. And that's really what happens with the emotional brain and the thinking brain. The emotional brain overrides the thinking brain, so there's no logic, no rationale, no thinking of solutions. We're just constantly in that flight or fight mode. And this is why it's so important to teach your staff coping strategies at the moment, or even, as we just heard Kelly talk from the HR presentation, just keep your staff informed. And then what you're doing is you're reducing the uncertainty. So you're reducing the adrenaline and the cortisol that is being put into their bloodstreams. Next slide, please, Paul. Okay, so let's look at stress. So stress is the beginning of poor mental health. And then the mental health is like it's a spectrum. So we go from poor mental health, that we can have severe mental health problems, and we can have good mental health. So sort of like imagine a line, there's a spectrum on there. So stress is the very beginning of poor mental health. And when I'm talking poor mental health, I'm talking anxiety, depression, you know, suicidal thoughts, etc. That's going into the more severe mental health. So when clients come and see me and they've started struggling with the mental health, they want to know what has caused them. What's one thing that has caused them to start struggling with the mental health, to want to go and get the antidepressants, or the fact that they're drinking more alcohol. And what I have to explain to them is that it's not just one thing, it's lots of things that have built up over the past few years, for example. So we may need to look at what's happened in the past few years, the stresses, the pressures, to see how they've got into that position. So stress is, the description of stress is perceived demands placed upon us versus perceived ability to handle the demands. So what you'll find is that you'll have a lot of staff members who are getting these demands placed upon them, and it's they don't believe that they can handle the demands. So, for example, home working, that because of their lack of being able to think that they can handle that demands, it's causing them more stress. So the more we can help them realise that they can handle these demands, then the more productive that they're going to be. And this is where, you know, again, Steve talked about the resilience. You know, it's the ability, like Steve said, to withstand changes that are happening with the environment and still continue to flourish. So we're talking about emotional resilience here. So too much stress, and our mental health starts to suffer. So we need to help our staff change their perception about their ability of handling the demands that are placed upon them. Next slide, please, Paul. So poor mental health, the way you think, feel and behave becomes impossible to cope with, which, as I've just said, can lead to severe mental health problems if not treated. Next slide, please, Paul. Okay, so let's look at where your responsibilities lie as a company owner or a manager or a supervisor. I will be doing a workshop online webinar next week, and I'll go into this in a lot more detail. It's going to be to really just focus on how to manage mental health as a manager. So I'll be touching on that in a lot more detail. So this is something very, very quick, but basically there's two different responsibilities when managing mental health. There's a manager's responsibility, the company's responsibility, and then there's the employee's responsibility. So a manager's responsibility is to actually discuss mental health, to have a conversation about it, to look at the workload that you're expecting your staff to do, and I know Kelly just touched on that before. We have to be offering support. So that is not that I'm going to fix you, I'm going to rescue you, I'm going to make you better. It's here's a list of places that can help you get help with your mental health. It's about being flexible, making adjustments. Again, in the next webinar at the end of next week, I'll be talking about under the Equality Act when you have to make adjustments. But what I would say in this time that we're going through now is try and be as flexible as possible for your employees. You know, try and have as many adjustments as possible for them where feasible. It's about signposting to other professionals that can help them by following up with them, so asking about their mental health, and then if they're telling you that they've got a challenge, follow up with them in a couple of weeks. How are you feeling? Did we get it sorted for you? And importantly, being comfortable with your emotions. So when you do start asking staff about the mental health, they may get upset, they may get angry, they may withdraw. It's about you being comfortable in holding that space and understanding that they've got a right to those emotions, and it's not your job to fix or heal those emotions. So the employee's responsibility is to look at what's causing them pressures in the home life, facing their personal issues, taking care of their own physical, mental, emotional and spiritual well-being. That's their responsibility, not yours. Being adult light, so not looking to you to sort out the issues as the employer, you know, acting as an adult. Accepting the help of professional support, listening to you, and importantly being honest with you. So, you know, if you ask your staff members about their mental health and they say no, everything's fine, I'm okay, and you've documented that, then you're covered because you've asked the question. If they choose not to be open, there's nothing that you can do about that. Next slide, please, Paul. Okay, so what I'd say in COVID times is the quicker you, well, in any times really, but applicable now, the quicker you take steps to talk to your staff about mental health and dissolve any problems, the quicker you're going to have some solutions, which means your productivity is not going to be affected, your business isn't going to be affected. And see that you're in this powerful position that you could be the only person that's actually bothered about their mental health. And, you know, when you look at presenteeism and engagement in staff, this is the stuff, it's the mental health, it's the poor mental health that prevents high levels of presenteeism and engagement. So if you can help them with the mental health, your presenteeism rates are going to go up and your engagement rates are going to go up as well. Next slide, please, Paul. So it's a 4-step process. Again, I'll expand on that in the longer webinar. You're going to create an awareness of mental health. That could simply just be sending an email entitled mental health, saying, right, let's start thinking about our mental health, guys. What can we do? How can we help? So that's as simple, creating awareness of mental health. It's then about having the conversation, which I'll cover in the next slide. Taking action to improve mental health, so documenting all this, and most importantly, always having a follow-up. Right, let's get back to you next week and let's see how you got on, for example. Next slide, please, Paul. So how do you have the conversation about mental health? Well, a lot of you will be doing this without even realising it. So it's saying things like, I noticed that you've been a little bit quiet recently. I noticed that you've been a little bit withdrawn recently. I noticed that you're losing your temper easily, and wondered how you are. How are you feeling? You seem a little down recently. You seem to be overwhelmed. Is there anything I can do to help? Yesterday in that meeting, I sensed you were unhappy and wondered if we could have a chat about it. So part of my role is to look at the demands that have been placed upon you under COVID. So I'm wondering how you're coping with it. Do you want to give me some feedback? We don't seem to have laughed much recently. How are you feeling about work at the moment? So whatever language you're happy to talk in, then talk in the language that you're happy with. You know, if you're happy saying, God, you seem really pissed off, then, you know, use that language. But more importantly, document it. Yeah, you know, document it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so just to finish, let's look at how you can manage mental health in yourself. 7th of May, I'll be doing a 2-hour webinar on this subject, so I'll have much more time to go into it and talk about it in a lot more detail, but just some quick wins here. So if you can go on, please. Okay, so first of all, some of you may have seen this before. This is something that I use quite a lot for myself. If I'm starting to get overwhelmed or feeling pressure, I'll ask myself 3 questions. Is it in my control? Is it something I can influence? And is it out of my control? If it's out of my control, then I don't want to know. I'm not going to get involved with it. So, you know, at the moment, it's out of my control how much PPE equipment there is. It's out of my control if we're doing testing. It's out of my control how many people are passing of this. That's not within my control. What I've got to spend my time and energy and focus on is looking at what is in my control for my business, for my son, for me, for my mental health. What can I control? Everything else you let go. Anything that's in that what is out of my control, you let go. You look at what you can influence, you try and influence something to be positive, and again, what you can't control, let it go. And that's going to take away drama, stress, tension, and your mental health is going to vastly improve. Next slide, please, Paul. Okay, so at the root of stress and at the root of poor mental health, it's so simple. It's the thinking. Our thinking creates our stress, because how we think is our reality. So if I'm sat every day thinking, am I going to have a business tomorrow? Where am I going to get my next money coming in from? When's this going to end? When am I going to start to be able to have clients in my house again, for example? If I'm thinking like that, that's fear-based thoughts, which is increasing adrenaline and cortisol flooding through my body, which means my stress is going to increase and my mental health is going to start to deteriorate. So if you're feeling on a night that you can't sleep, just get a piece of paper and just write down every single thought that is flying through your head. Then take a fresh look at it, maybe in the morning or whatever, and say, right, what evidence have I got that this is true? What can I control? What can't I control? I'm going to cross out everything that I can't control, and what action can I take to start to deal with this thinking I think is going to happen. So, that's such a root thing to look at when you're looking at mental health. And of course, your employees will have negative thinking as well. So ask them what they're thinking, then challenge their negative thoughts in a nice way, of course, to say, well, what evidence have we got that that's true? There might not be any. Next slide, please, Paul. Okay, so again, have realistic expectations about yourself and for your employees. So if you've been, if you're having now to work from home and you've got young children, there is no way on earth that you are going to be able to do the same amount of work as when you did when, the children were at school or nursery, or you was at work, etc. So manage your own expectations and manage those of those that you work with. Have the courage to admit if you're struggling, because your employer has got a duty of care to help you, but only if you do talk to them and are open about it. And just drop the perfectionistic expectations. I'm finding myself that I'm not working from 9 in the morning till 5, because obviously I'm wondering a bit what's going on. So just be more realistic about dealing with this stressful time and how you can manage to deal with that stressful time, and have those conversations with your staff members as well. Next slide, please, Paul. Okay, so the best way to reduce stress is to get balance in your life, and you'll see you've sort of like got 4 boxes here, and it's about balancing it up. So work, rest, play, and looking at your future. So many of us are just conditioned to look at that work box, and we just focus on that work box. And it's not just work as in like work, but it's also things like, you know, doing the shopping or filling your car up with petrol or managing your accounts or running the kids to places. So what's really important is to look at the other 2 boxes of rest and play. How am I getting effective rest? How am I getting play? How am I having fun? How am I chilling? How am I cutting out of just being, you know, analysing my work and what's going on? So really try and put some actions into each of those other boxes. Last slide, please, Paul. Okay, so just to finish off, it's really important that you learn how to relax. And I know that sounds really stupid, and I'm not going to say, you know, you need to meditate or whatever. It's about what it says there. You've got a doorway that you're using, your prefrontal cortex. That doorway is what you're thinking, you know, all the time that you're at work and then when you get home. And it's about creating a space that you can come out of that overthinking and move into a space of relaxing. So it's about what actually helps me to relax. So, you know, getting in from work, having your tea, you know, flopping on the settee with a Netflix or a bottle of wine or a few beers, that is not effective relaxing. Your body, your immune system is not going to relax from doing that. So it's about having things like boundaries, you know, turning the computer off at 7 o'clock at night, putting your mobile phone in a different room so you're not tempted to check your Gmails, having a bath with the lock on the door so the kids can't interrupt you, you know, putting some headphones on and doing a visualization that's you've got off YouTube or whatever. So it's about taking a step back and going, okay, how do I relax? How do I effectively relax? Maybe going for a run or a walk or, you know, whatever. And again, I'll be expanding on these in more detail in the next webinar. Okay, next slide, please, Paul. Okay, final slide then. So focusing on your own mental health, if you're a company owner, if you're a manager, is even more important, because there's a great analogy out there. If you don't put your oxygen mask on and to get oxygen in you, you know, if you're on an aeroplane and they say, right, you've got to put your oxygen mask on before helping others, this is exactly the same analogy. You've got to feed yourself with positive mental health strategies so that you can help your staff. It's about looking at how to, you know, manage the mental health in others. Just have that simple conversation, just create the awareness. And the 2 workshops that we'll be looking at in future under this scheme is there's going to be Tuesday 28th of April, 2:30 till 4:30, manage employees' mental health. So I'll go into it in a lot more detail. It's been quite rushed today. How, as a manager, do I manage my employees' mental health? And then Thursday, the 7th of May, managing your own mental health. So I'll be giving you 10 ways to manage your own mental health in that sense. So I hope this has been useful for you. Sorry it was a little bit rushed, but I'm aware that we've gone over time. And if you've got any questions, then please just type in the box.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm just trying to unmute everybody for this last section. Yes, as it says on your screen there, we'll be going into a lot more detail about mental health and how we can support you and your employees in further detail across the next 2 sessions. So to find out more about that, I'll show you about how you can access them. We've not actually had many questions today in today's session. We have had one more. I'm going to read that one out now. So I'll hand this out to everybody really. Is there any clarification on insurance claims for loss of stock or loss of business, specifically according to closure of certain businesses? I'm not sure if everybody can hear me there.
I missed that, sorry.
Sorry, I'll just repeat that one. Yeah. The question
Quite a bit
is,
of feedback.
oh dear. Right. The question is there any government support available in terms of insurance support available or loss of product or stock? Or perhaps cancellation, particularly because of the instructions to close businesses.
Still didn't get it, sorry.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry. If I can follow on, it seems that we've got a bit of an audio issue here. I'm just going to try and close everybody off. Okay. For the person that asked that question, I would encourage you please just to contact the Growth Hub on the email you'll get following this presentation. What you'll be able to do is ask that question, and one of our team will be able to get back to you specifically about the question you've just asked. It seems that we've got some kind of audio issue here today. That does seem to be the only question we've had today, though. So I'll move you on to the next steps. For those that are interested, we are running this session again next week, this drop-in session with our specialist panel to run through, recap some of the things you've heard today and to build on some of the advice that you've been provided. So you can log on to growmysme.co.uk/events, where you'll be able to find out what information is available. As Rachel's already mentioned, we'll be running a Managing Mental Health for Your Employees. That's running next Tuesday, 2:30 to 4:30. And we'll be able to go into a lot more detail than we have done today in terms of how you can manage mental health for your employee base that might be working remotely at the moment. We have overrun today, so I thank you for keeping with us today. As usual, for any further support, please go to the website on your screen today to get all the up-to-date information from the Humber Growth Hub, Business Growth Hub. But thank you for your time, for your attention today. A lot of information thrown at you. If you do think of any questions, please feel free to contact the Growth Hub or log on to our session next week to ask your questions, and we'll be able to answer them for you. As it is for today, thank you very much for joining us and have a safe week. Goodbye.